Cheers, loser. We're getting divorced. I already posted it online. My wife announced at our anniversary dinner, fully expecting me to beg her to reconsider. Instead, I quietly reclaimed every asset, the house, the cars, and the money she believed was hers. My wife clinked her wine glass against mine, delivering the news as if it were the punchline of a great joke. Cheers. We're getting divorced. I already posted it online. She smiled so wide her back molar, still marked with lipstick, was visible. People at the next table turned their heads, watching. She didn't care. In fact, she craved an audience. While the wine in her glass was still settling, I reached inside my jacket and pulled out the house keys. I deliberately placed them next to her fork, like a minimal tip. Good luck tomorrow, I stated, completely devoid of anger or a raised voice. Then I stood up, pushed my chair neatly under the table, and left 2 crisp $$100 bills. The waiter rushed over. I returned his polite nod. Melissa tilted her head, confusion etching her face like a bewildered dog. Wait, what? She asked, but I offered no reply. I was already moving toward the door, passing the valet stand, and stepping out into the cool night air. Her laughter still echoed behind me, audible even after the door was closed. She genuinely thought she had leverage over me. She had no clue she had just celebrated the beginning of her own financial ruin, a predicament entirely of her own making. And for the record, if you haven't subscribed yet, your click really supports the team in bringing you more stories like this one. Over $90% of you enjoy our content without subscribing. It only takes a second, but it provides incredible motivation for us. Now, let's return to her moment of triumph. You see, Melissa always had a flair for the dramatic. Not charmingly eccentric, but the kind of person who must be the focus of attention to feel alive. If it wasn't published on social media, it simply didn't happen. If there wasn't an audience, she had no motivation to invest emotion. She had her phone propped against the water pitcher, filming a quick reel. I could read the on-screen caption before she even posted it. Year 18, finally free. It marked our $18 year wedding anniversary. I still remembered her wearing green Converse sneakers at that Utah gas station, passionately talking about rescuing stray dogs. The woman sitting across from me now would easily trade a stray dog for a lucrative brand deal. She assumed I would plead, beg, or perhaps even break down crying. What she failed to grasp, what she never cared to notice, is that for $3 long years, I had been silently positioning the critical pieces of the puzzle. You spend that much time living with a narcissist and you learn to suppress your emotions, to smile even while hurting. You also understand that the most potent weapon a man can wield is patience, especially a man who controls more than just the marital residence. She assumed she was automatically entitled to half the assets, half the savings, and half the retirement fund I built. Yet, she never once inquired about the late-night business calls. She completely missed the fact that the trust documents left on the coffee table were not hypothetical legal jargon. She would casually glance at them, dismiss them with a scoff, and immediately return to editing her videos. Paul's little hobby, she'd sneer. That so-called hobby now held the deed to everything. I recall the waiter asking, right before my departure, "Was everything to your liking, sir?" I paused, looking at Melissa, who was suspended mid-toast, her eyes nervously flickering between her phone screen and me, unable to commit to one reality. I gave a slight smile and replied, "It will be." By the time the full weight of my meaning hit her, the access codes had already been changed. The bank manager was operating under new instructions, and the supposedly joint accounts were merely masked, never truly shared. Every asset she flaunted online had been secured within a revocable trust. Every car title had been quietly re-registered. Even the lease for her independent business studio was signed by a holding company, mine. She toasted her freedom, oblivious to the fact that she was celebrating her own financial ruin. Melissa awoke the next morning like a child on Christmas Day, except her gifts were comments, likes, and direct messages overflowing her phone. Her little announcement had instantly gone viral within her specific niche on Instagram. The post was simple: a wine glass, a designer suitcase, and the caption, "Freedom, at last," paired with a kissing and a victory hand emoji. Her makeup was, as always, flawless. She'd taken the photo immediately after I walked out of the restaurant. She had already composed the caption before I even settled the bill, a detail that provided me some late-night amusement. She was so convinced of the script she was writing, the strong woman finally escaping the boring insurance guy, a source of inspiration for the brunch crowd. Her followers anticipated this outcome, too. Comment after comment called her brave, inspiring, and a total queen. What she didn't anticipate, what none of them could have predicted, was that the very moment her empowerment fantasy took off, her phone screen would simply go dark. At first, she assumed a simple malfunction. She tapped it, swiped, nothing happened. Plugging it into the charger didn't help. The Apple logo flashed, and then froze, repeating the cycle. She muttered something about needing a Genius Bar appointment and rolled her eyes. But then came the crushing realization. She opened her laptop and tried to access the joint bank account, the one she used for expensive spa sessions, boutique clothes, and those business expenses that consistently involved Nordstrom. The screen flashed, invalid password. She tried once more. The same result. She clicked forgot password, but was met with access denied. The eye roll quickly transformed into a sharp, involuntary gasp. Melissa was unprepared for this kind of digital resistance. She called the bank, her irritation barely contained before she even navigated the menu options. Yes, hi, this is Melissa Howard. I can't access my account. Ma'am, the representative said after a pause, we cannot give information to anyone other than the primary signatory. I'm his wife, she snapped. I'm on the account. Another hesitation. Ma'am, the representative continued, speaking more carefully. You were removed yesterday at 4:47 p.m. Your access has been revoked by the primary account holder. Silence. Then what the hell are you talking about? I can give you the branch manager's number if you'd like to discuss it further. She immediately hung up. A call from her studio assistant came in. Melissa attempted to answer, but the call dropped. She tried again. The phone completely powered off. She threw it across the room. Her heart was now pounding furiously, not just because she couldn't spend money, but because she couldn't fathom how I had moved with such speed and efficiency. In her mind, she held the initiative. She had proudly flown her freedom flag. She expected people to tell her, leave him, girl, and for me to appear lost, pathetic, and confused. Instead, she was systematically locked out of her entire life. She rushed to her car and drove straight to the bank. Surely her name on her driver's license had to count for something. The teller looked bewildered when she arrived. I need to speak to the manager, she demanded. Regarding what, he asked. My joint account, she snapped. The manager appeared moments later, polite, but noticeably nervous. I'm sorry, Mrs. Howard. Without authorization from the primary signatory, I can't provide any information. Do you know who I am? You've been seeing me in here a dozen times. Yes, but that is irrelevant to the current situation. Then call him now. Call Paul. I'm not leaving until he speaks to me. The manager looked indecisive. She noticed a subtle shift in his eyes, perhaps respect, maybe even a touch of fear. It was then that the truth began to sink in, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, inevitable poison. I hadn't just tolerated her announcement. I had meticulously planned for it. Every action she took that morning felt like running headfirst into a brick wall she hadn't seen coming. She was blinded by her own arrogance, never bothering to look. Outside the bank, her car displayed a low battery warning. Then, before the system died again, a message briefly flashed across her screen. Primary user access revoked. Contact account administrator. For the first time in years, Melissa realized she was completely removed from controlling the narrative, understanding now that she never truly held that power. By the time Melissa aggressively entered the branch that afternoon, the sun was losing its warmth. She parked haphazardly across two spots, slammed the car door without bothering to lock it, and marched across the pavement as if the very ground owed her an apology. Her hair, naturally, was flawless, the same hyper-curated, effortlessly put together look featured in all her videos. But her eyes were frantic, and her jaw was clenched tight. The illusion of control was rapidly crumbling. She went directly to the main counter and dropped her handbag with a heavy thud. I need to speak with your manager, she snapped, loud enough to silence the entire lobby. A mother with a baby looked up. An older man near the mortgage window frowned. The young teller behind the counter visibly swallowed. Do you have an appointment? Do I look like I need one? She hissed. Just tell him Melissa Howard is here. He knows me. But he didn't know her. That was the core issue. The assistant vanished, followed by murmured voices through the frosted glass. Then Charles, the branch manager, appeared, a man Melissa had always dismissed as a petty rule follower with bad breath. He approached with the wary gait of someone walking toward a known hazard. Mrs. Howard, he began carefully. I understand you're having trouble accessing certain services. I'm having trouble accessing my own life, she shot back. I've been locked out of everything, and your customer service staff has been useless. You need to fix this right now. Charles subtly glanced over his shoulder, buying a moment of time. As I informed you this morning, the accounts in question are governed by the primary signatory. I am his wife, she stated, over-enunciating each syllable as if performing for a jury. He clasped his hands together. That is no longer a qualifying condition under the current structure. Melissa blinked hard. The what? He looked pained. A trust entity was formally established last year, granting controlling authority over all major holdings. We are legally compelled to follow the directives of that entity's signatory. And you're telling me I'm not included? She paused. Leaning closer, her voice razor-sharp, she demanded, then call him right now. I want him to tell me this to my face. And then, as if choreographed with cruel precision, the bell above the bank's main entrance chimed. Melissa spun around, and Paul entered. He was not the predictable man in khakis and mild manners she thought she knew. Not the guy who wore the same watch and clumsily navigated his phone settings like an elderly man in a coffee shop. This Paul wore a sharply tailored navy suit. His tie was perfectly knotted. His shoes gleamed. He wore no wedding ring. There was no sign of confusion or hesitation, only quiet confidence and focus. He was the kind of man who arrived not when called, but when the time was right. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. A young woman at the lone desk straightened up. The security guard offered a small, respectful nod. Melissa stumbled backward as Paul walked past her without a flicker of recognition, heading directly toward Charles. "Sir," the manager said quickly, "we're ready to proceed." Melissa's voice cracked. "What the hell is going on?" Paul finally looked at her, his expression neither angry nor smug, simply exhausted. "I told you," he said softly. "Good luck tomorrow." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was unable to comprehend the sudden reversal of roles. The man she had ridiculed for years, calling him boring, old-fashioned, a mere prop, was now speaking a language of financial power she didn't recognize. Worse still, everyone else in the room understood it perfectly. Charles handed Paul a clipboard. Paul signed swiftly, nodded, and immediately began discussing transfer documentation with 3 additional staff members who had suddenly appeared. Melissa didn't recognize any of them. She had always assumed she knew everyone Paul worked with. After all, she believed him to be a quiet, semi-retired figure from a dull corner of the insurance world. What she never cared to ask, what she never bothered to investigate, was my true occupation. She completely missed the subtle LLC name change $3 years earlier. She never noticed the corporate correspondence arriving under a holding company name she never bothered to Google. She assumed the leather binder I kept in the study was just mundane legal reading for before bed, the sort of dry material old men read before falling asleep watching cable news. In reality, that binder contained the operational architecture for a network of shell companies, the details of various trusts, and the signatures that gave me sole control over every asset she had ever associated with her name. The most effective detail? She had signed off on half of it herself, usually with a distracted smile and a simple, "Just tell me where to scribble." She stood there now, in a bank where she commanded no respect, watching the man she thought she knew calmly dismantle the entire illusion she had constructed around herself. She instinctively reached for her phone, still frozen. Her image could not save her this time, because this was not a story she could filter and post. This was reality. And in this reality, Paul, the man she had underestimated $18 years, was not retired. He was just waiting for her move. Melissa slammed the front door so hard the hallway mirror vibrated. She violently kicked off her heels, sending one of them crashing against the wall. Then, she marched into the living room, a woman ready to take out her aggression on the nearest surface. Her perfectly manicured hand snatched the heavy divorce agreement binder from the console table where she had carelessly tossed it weeks ago. Back then, when she thought signing it was merely a formality, like submitting a resignation letter you've already announced on Instagram, she hadn't even read it. Why would she bother? She was in command, holding the upper hand, the narrative, and the followers. Paul was merely expected to quietly fade into a long, boring sunset on a golf cart. Now, the document felt alive and dangerous in her hands. She flipped it open, speeding past the main terms, the clauses she had glossed over, the kind of standard text lawyers churn out in their sleep. Alimony expectations, property division, car titles, all familiar, all things she had laughed about over Chardonnay, telling her sister, "He just wants out. I'm doing him a favor." But that night, her fingers abruptly stopped on a page near the end. Its format differed from the others. It bore her signature in blue ink, a second notarized signature from Paul's lawyers, and a small, centered heading that read, Supplementary Clause C, Discretionary Oversight and Conditional Waiver. She squinted, read the text, and her stomach immediately dropped. In the event that the division of assets is initiated under circumstances deemed reputationally damaging, performative, or publicly derogatory, all agreed-upon transfers may be subject to a discretionary audit and delay under the authority of the Revocable Estate Trust, here and after the trust. There it was, in the impenetrable language of the law, a clear condemnation of her actions, publicly mocking the divorce online, turning their separation into a trendy reel complete with wine glasses and hashtags. She triggered the clause the instant she publicly declared, "Cheers, we're getting divorced," on camera, and Paul had been counting on it. She checked the date next to the signatures. It was the morning after her trip to Colorado Springs, when she had tossed him a pen and mumbled, "Just sign it, so we can stop dragging this out." He had held her gaze for 3 long seconds before signing. She had been so confidently superior about it, boasting to friends, "He's too old to fight. He just wants peace." In truth, he only wanted a definitive paper trail. She reached for her phone. Dead. She raced to her laptop, opened Chrome, logged into Instagram, and frantically deleted the divorce post, the finally free reel, and the video of her friends toasting her, "Welcome to singlehood cake." Then she went to Facebook, removing every status and sarcastic remark, meticulously erasing her digital presence like a suspect covering their tracks. But it was too late. Attached to Supplementary Clause C was an addendum. All publicly accessible materials may be submitted as demonstrative evidence to the Trust Council. Retraction does not nullify effect. He had documentation. She knew he had documentation, probably notarized and timestamped files secured by his legal team. Paul's consistency was something she'd never respected. She saw his discipline as evidence of a dull life. She never realized it was his defensive armor. Now, every self-satisfied caption, every mocking emoji, and every passive-aggressive TikTok she had created was a weapon aimed directly at her. Her grand public gesture was now simply Exhibit A. She staggered into the kitchen, suddenly parched. She grabbed a glass and filled it with water, her hands trembling so badly she splashed half the contents onto the counter. The problem wasn't just the potential loss of half the assets. The clause introduced the possibility of a total reassessment. If the trust determined she had violated the good faith agreement, and it was engineered to ensure that finding everything could be indefinitely paused, subject to review, and ultimately, discretionary. This meant Paul's legal team held the ultimate control. She could be stuck in limbo for years. No house, no studio, no car access, and no retirement funds. Melissa slid down the cabinet until she was sitting on the floor, still clutching the glass. She stared blankly at the tiles, her breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. For $18 years, she had believed herself to be the astute one, the master of influence, manipulation, and image. She had overlooked a basic truth. Intelligence is measured not by volume, but by the quiet intensity of one's preparations while the other person is busy boasting. Paul never argued. He never begged. He simply wrote Clause AC and waited patiently. The following morning, Melissa was awake before sunrise, not due to ambition, but because she had spent the entire night down a digital rabbit hole of her own making. $3 hours of intense web searches, $5 hours frantically sifting through paper documents, and half a bottle of Sancerre later, she slumped at the kitchen island in a silk robe. Her mascara was smeared, her laptop illuminated the dark room, and her hands still shook. She started by typing the name, Rowan Sentinel Holdings, LLC. She had dismissed it as a simple shell company created by Paul's lawyer when she first saw it in the trust clause. Yet, when she ran the name through the public property search engine, there it was. The house was registered under Rowan's name. The Audi she drove to her weekly Pilates class. Rowan's. Even the downtown studio she continually boasted about owning outright, where she ran her luxury home decor consultancy, listed Rowan Sentinel Holdings as the property owner. Her name appeared on 0 deeds. She checked and scanned the results again, still nothing. Rowan Sentinel Holdings had silently acquired every asset over the past $3 years. All were title transfers with retained use rights. A technicality Paul had tried to explain to her over dinner while she was distracted by online purse ads. She remembered that night vividly now. She had laughed, genuinely laughed. "Oh, is this your little retirement game, Paul?" she had joked over wine. "Your invisible empire, so mysterious." He hadn't reacted, only looked at her, blinked once, and said, "I prefer quiet assets." She had simply rolled her eyes. She thought his meticulousness with paperwork and corporate structures was endearing. She called it old man Tetris. She never once asked what the company actually did. It turned out Rowan Sentinel was far more than a simple trust mechanism. It was a sophisticated holding company, established by Paul with unassailable governance. It possessed its own bylaws, an advisory board, and a council. The legal documentation spanned 3 states and 4 separate legal jurisdictions. It was absolutely legitimate and completely outside her ownership. The only items Melissa still technically owned were her clothing, her paid-off credit card balance, and a tote bag she got as a PR gift at an interior design conference. Everything else had been extended to her under terms she never bothered to read. These terms were buried within the updates she habitually ignored whenever Paul emailed her a document with the simple instruction, "Just click to approve." She clicked every single time without questioning the content. She believed she was just authorizing some trivial tax efficiency play. Instead, she was handing over the keys to the kingdom piece by piece. The most damning detail. The revocable trust granted Paul total power to revoke access from any beneficiary in case of conflict, misconduct, or, Melissa paused, chilled by this line, demonstrated malice or reputational damage. No lawyer was needed to interpret that. Her posts, her jokes, the wine glass photo, all documented proof. The previous night, the trust had issued an internal notice. She saw the PDF forwarded from an anonymous email, which she assumed was Paul's final twist of the knife. Beneficiary access revoked. ID M. Howard. The date was yesterday's. Melissa picked up her phone, which was finally functioning after a forced factory reset, and opened her banking application. Declined. She checked her calendar. The day was packed with client consultations, people she had promised luxurious redesigns to, largely based on the aesthetic of her now inaccessible home. She couldn't even get back inside to take fresh photos. She sent a desperate email to her assistant. Remove everything from the site that references the showcase house, immediately. Then another. We still have the renders for the Dunlap project. Use those instead. She stopped. That project was also registered in Paul's name, and the license was tied to him. She had nothing left. No foundation, no bargaining chip, not even a believable story to cling to. She clicked back to the public business database. Rowan Sentinel Holdings listed 6 directors. She recognized none of them. Paul's name was notably absent. This was the moment the full truth resonated. This was not a spontaneous act of vengeance, nor was it a desperate maneuver by a wounded husband. This was a strategy executed years in advance. The trust had been expanding, acquiring, and registering while she spent her time posing for phone cameras and planning her dramatic public exit. Paul hadn't just prepared for the divorce. He made sure there was literally nothing left for her to take when she finally left. She got the dramatic performance. He retained the stage, the rights, the equipment, and the lease to the theater. Melissa stared at her own reflection in the dark screen. Throughout her life, she had been convinced she was the sharpest person in the room. It turns out the quietest man at the table had been building an impenetrable fortress while she was bragging about stealing the key. The spa receptionist offered a pleasant smile as Melissa presented the shining platinum card, her rose gold manicure on display. Let's reserve the steam room for another hour, she requested casually, pushing her sunglasses up her head. She desperately needed this, a deep tissue massage, a facial, maybe a glass of cucumber champagne in the garden lounge. Anything to restore her composure, sharpen her focus, and remind herself of her worth. Then the unmistakable sound. The card terminal flashed red and emitted a high-pitched chirp. Declined. I'm sorry, could you try that one more time? Melissa asked with a strained laugh, feigning disbelief. The machine must be faulty. The receptionist tried again. The same result, she stated. Melissa leaned in, whispering, process it as credit. The woman looked uncomfortable. The message says the account is restricted. Melissa frowned. That's the shared account. Run it again, ma'am. The employee began to explain, but Melissa was already reaching for her phone, dialing the customer service number, her nails rapidly tapping the counter. Yes. Hi. I'm calling about a declined card. Yes, my name is Melissa Howard. My husband and I share this account. A pause. Ma'am, the agent replied. You were removed from that account 3 days ago. No, that's incorrect. This is our main account. Not anymore. Melissa abruptly ended the call mid-sentence. She stormed out of the spa, her robe billowing, her heels clicking aggressively against the tiles. She reached her car, the sleek white Mercedes convertible, and yanked the door open. The digital dashboard displayed an immediate warning. Vehicle requires verification. Owner override engaged. She attempted to start the engine. Nothing happened. She slammed the door shut. Are you serious? Then, she noticed the name on the registration inside the glove box. Paul W. Howard. It was never actually hers. She grabbed her purse and began walking 5 blocks to the bank, sweating profusely through her expensive workout gear. When she arrived, she slapped her palm against the glass entrance, demanding attention. Inside, Charles, the manager, saw her and came to the door himself. I need access, she hissed. All of this freezing is affecting my life. He opened the door only enough to speak. I'm sorry, Mrs. Howard. I informed you that the accounts are undergoing review by the trust's legal division. Access is suspended until the audit is complete. What audit? It's a mandatory step after a clause activation. You should have received notification. Clause? What clause? He offered no answer, simply looking at her with the weary resignation of a man observing someone drown in a pool they boasted about building. She turned away, furiously dialing Paul's number. Straight to voicemail. She sent a text message, "You can't do this." She paced on the sidewalk across the street, jaw clenched, thumbs rapidly typing. Another message. "This is financial abuse. I will expose you." The reply arrived within $30 seconds. "You look insane. Legally done." 3 words, cutting her like a knife. She gasped, her fingers gripping the phone. She tried calling again, but it went straight to voicemail. Fine, she thought. I'll go home. Her real home, the one she personally designed, painted, and filmed tours of for her loyal followers. She called a rideshare and gave the address for the gated community. The driver glanced at her several times in the rearview mirror, probably noticing her desperate expression and smudged mascara. When she arrived, she got out and entered the gate code. Access denied. She tried again. Access denied. She called the intercom. No answer. After a full $5 minutes, a neighbor drove up, and Melissa quickly slipped through the gate behind them. She reached the front door and grabbed the knob. Locked. She checked beneath the planter. No spare key. She walked around the house to the side door near the patio. Locked. She picked up a decorative rock from the garden edging and seriously considered smashing a window. But an inner block stopped her. Not from fear of criminal consequences, but because for the first time since this ordeal began, she realized she didn't know what she still possessed the right to break. She sank onto the front steps, her legs trembling uncontrollably. Inside that house was the totality of what she thought she controlled. Her walk-in closet, her designer kitchen, her custom soaking tub, her fake greenery, her carefully curated lighting, her entire lifestyle. But the locks were changed, the ownership was transferred, and she was now just a woman sitting on someone else's front porch, begging entry into a fantasy she hadn't actually built. She stared at the door. The door remained immobile, and so did Paul. He didn't answer, didn't argue, didn't yell. He simply erased her, system by system, not motivated by malice, but by the same quiet exactitude she had used to craft her counterfeit perfect life. Her elimination was systematic, not emotional. She had become a phantom in her own narrative, realizing only now that the story was never truly hers to begin with. Melissa had just finished her third espresso that morning, though finished really meant spilling most of it onto her wrist while desperately attempting to log into another restricted online platform, when her divorce lawyer, Nolan, burst into her temporary apartment unannounced. She hadn't seen him this agitated since he mishandled her previous business partnership settlement, the one she vowed to overcome by marrying better the next time. His tie was askew, his face pale and stressed. He tossed his leather briefcase onto the marble island as if it had personally wronged him. "You failed to inform me about the trust," he barked. She blinked, taken aback by his aggressive tone. "Excuse me." He pulled out a manila folder, slammed it onto the counter, and leaned over it like a prosecuting attorney presenting the murder weapon, or in this case, a post-nuptial agreement dated $2 years ago. Melissa's jaw slackened. What post-nuptial agreement? Nolan flipped the folder open with the surgical precision of courtroom drama. Inside was a high-resolution scanned copy of a contract, featuring a notary seal, a lawyer's countersignature, and her own flamboyant, looping signature at the bottom, complete with a tiny heart above the I in Melissa. She stared at it, convinced it was a forgery or a prank. "I've never seen this," she mumbled, the statement sounding hollow even to her own ears. "You signed it," Nolan snapped, "right after that trip to Sedona $2 years ago." "That is absolutely impossible," she insisted, her hands already shaking. "I would remember something that significant." "You never read it," he interrupted sharply. "He sent it to you via DocuSign with the subject line, Household Financial Updates. You clicked, you signed. You were at the spa. I checked the timestamp. 5 minutes after you posted a boomerang video of that mud bath on the cliff." Melissa's lips parted, her heart hammering in her chest. A sudden wave of memory hit her. The resort robe, her second mimosa. Paul had texted her something like, "Need your signature on this before the end of the day." She had been annoyed, greasy from a sea salt wrap, and eager to get back to choosing pillow swatches for the study. So, she signed it immediately, never opening the document, never asking a single question. Nolan tapped the document. "This legally nullifies all claims to community property, everything." Her voice cracked. "That cannot possibly be lawful." "It is entirely lawful," he retorted, pulling out another page. "Because your signature is here, and initialed again here. The notary seal was done remotely, approved by your previous estate lawyer, the one you fired last year because you didn't like her tone." Melissa grabbed the page, quickly scanning the clinical, cold text. It was all there. Clause 4. In the event of separation or divorce, any property held in the name of a trust or corporate entity shall remain the sole legal asset of the designated holder. Clause 4.3. The spouse acknowledges and agrees that no claim may be filed against said entities in any future action. Clause 4.7. The agreement supersedes any previous assumption of shared asset rights under local marital property laws. She looked up at Nolan, barely breathing. "Why didn't you catch this?" she pleaded. "I can't catch documents you deliberately kept hidden from me," he shot back. "Do you even know how many of your assets were already under a trust at the exact moment you signed that agreement?" She didn't, of course. Paul had always managed the financial complexities. She was preoccupied with filming Get Ready With Me segments in silk pajamas. The legal backbone of their marriage was always his responsibility. She was the public image. He was the foundation. She mistakenly believed that the foundation was irrelevant as long as she was attractive enough. You proceeded under the mistaken belief that you were guaranteed half. Nolan continued sternly. Half the house, half the cars, at least a partial stake in the studio lease. But I'm telling you, you don't own the studio. You don't own the cars. You don't even own the domain name for your design brand's website. It's registered to one of his holding companies, and the administrative email belongs to his lawyers. Melissa gripped the edge of the counter tightly. Fix it, she whispered. I cannot fix this, he said, throwing his hands up in defeat. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a sophisticated legal ambush. You walked straight into it in a haze of eucalyptus steam and sealed the door behind you. She collapsed onto a bar stool, staring at the folder as if expecting it to burst into flames. $2 years ago. That was when she still considered Paul harmless, a little dull, a touch unremarkable. She used to jokingly refer to him as the human retirement plan behind his back at brunch, convinced of her own cleverness. But while she was sipping mimosas and laughing with friends, he was methodically fortifying the perimeter of his entire empire, brick by silent brick. Now she was the one trapped. No resources, no escape plan, and the deepest sting of all, she had constructed the cage herself with a single, thoughtless click. The call came just after noon. Melissa was sitting on the floor of her studio, surrounded by her fabric swatches and expensive staging candles. Her cappuccino remained untouched, the foam slowly deflating like the rest of her week. She answered on the second ring, forcing her usual practiced cheerfulness into her voice. Hi, Janice. Silence. Then, Melissa, we're pulling out. The word struck her with physical force. Wait, what? We're terminating the Newton remodel immediately. Melissa was stunned. That's a 6-month project. We signed a design agreement. We are already in phase 2. The tiles are ready. Janice cut her off. Our legal team reviewed the contract. There is an active exit clause. Melissa stood up slowly, gripping the edge of her desk for support. Why? Another significant pause. Then came the final, brutal blow. There are rumors, Melissa, Janice explained cautiously. Online whispers claim you misrepresented the ownership of your design space, that your business is embroiled in legal conflicts. There's talk of a trust seizing your assets, and allegations of fraud. Melissa's throat tightened painfully. None of that is true. Janice sighed wearily. I wanted to believe you, but our CFO verified the property records this morning. You don't own the studio. Rowan Sentinel Holdings owns it, the same entity linked to numerous asset liens across the state. It belongs to your husband, doesn't it? Your ex-husband. She wanted to scream the denial, but the word was stuck. You led us to believe this space was yours, Janice continued, her voice now colder. You claimed you purchased it outright, that it was your creative sanctuary. It is mine, Melissa insisted fiercely. I manage the business here. You manage it, Janice repeated, emphasizing the distinction. But you don't own it. There's a critical difference, and we cannot risk being drawn into someone else's financial breakdown. The line immediately went dead. Melissa stared at her phone for a long moment before letting it fall onto the rug. Breakdown. It was no longer a figure of speech. It was unfolding in real time. By 3:00 p.m., 3 more clients had postponed their projects indefinitely. One had already initiated a PayPal dispute demanding a refund for a preliminary mood board. Another discreetly asked her assistant if Melissa was under criminal investigation. The gossip spread through the design community with the speed of a wildfire, outpacing any marketing campaign she could ever deploy. Clients wanted trendsetters with spotless reputations, inspiring captions, and the illusion of flawless success. Melissa no longer fit that brand image. She opened the studio's license agreement on her iPad, preparing to terminate it before the situation escalated to a lawsuit and a public spectacle. The document was pristine, a signed PDF titled Property Branding and Occupancy Agreement, Studio 4A. She scrolled to the signature page. There it was. Owner, Rowan Sentinel Holdings LLC. Tenant, Melissa Howard. Occupancy license only. She stared at the words. License only. No lease, no standard rental rights, no tenant protection. She hadn't noticed the term before. Paul had insisted on handling everything when she declared, I don't do paperwork. Just make it simple and pretty for me. He had made it too simple. She scrolled further. Clause 8 stipulated. The licensor reserves the right to revoke occupancy at will with $15 days notice if the licensee is determined to have engaged in breach of the reputational conduct standards outlined in Section 6. She clicked to Section 6. One line was in bold. The licensee shall not engage in public conduct that brings reputational harm to the licensor or associated entities. Every post, every video, every sarcastic caption that veiled a slight against Paul instantly flashed in her mind like a field of active landmines. This wasn't just a clause. It was a strategically placed tripwire. She managed to reach the trust's legal office. A woman answered with an expressionless, monotone voice. Yes, Mrs. Howard, your access license is scheduled for revocation in $10 business days. You will receive an official notification by courier. I strongly suggest you begin the relocation process. Melissa let out a strange sound, perhaps a laugh, or maybe a choked sob. Relocate where? That falls outside the scope of our responsibilities, the voice replied calmly. We solely manage the property rights. And just like that, her studio was lost. Not in a blaze or a public scandal, but quietly and systematically. She stood in the middle of her former empire, the space she had filmed, boasted about, and called her sanctuary for years, a space that had never once been hers. The images on her website were taken on property she didn't own. The brand she sold was built on legal terms she failed to read. The empire she flaunted was constructed on borrowed ground, and the true owner had just calmly taken it all back. Melissa collapsed onto the velvet sofa, under the gold-framed painting that declared, manifested. The irony was almost enough to make her laugh again. Almost. Melissa was now curled up on her mother's uncomfortable guest bed, her knees drawn close, under a blanket that smelled distinctly of lavender and old age. Her immaculate nails were chipped. Her phone was down to its last $6% of battery life. For 2 full days, she had been a fugitive in her own life, hiding in the small apartment she once condescendingly referred to as a Plan B, surrounded by floral wallpaper and porcelain angels that made her skin crawl. Her mother had stopped offering comfort, worn out by the endless drama, the legal threats, the trust details, exhausted by the daughter who once carried herself with such arrogance, but now paced the kitchen like a hungry raccoon. When her phone lit up, she almost didn't answer. Restricted number. She hesitated, then swiped. Hello. Mrs. Howard, a clipped voice stated. This is Rena Keeler from the Hills Senior Complex Property Management. I am calling regarding Unit 3B, the apartment listed in your mother's name. Melissa sat bolt upright. What about it? We have received directives from Rowan Sentinel Holdings concerning the lien on this property. They are proceeding with the reassignment. No, I don't understand. That apartment belongs to my mother. What possible involvement could Paul have? Another pause. The original down payment for this unit was issued through a discretionary trust affiliated with Mr. Paul Howard. The lien was recorded accordingly. We have received and verified the documents authorizing the transfer. Melissa's throat constricted. Transfer to what? To the holding company. Effective immediately. Utility service coverage has been suspended. Water and power will be disconnected in 5 business days unless alternative arrangements are finalized. You can't do that. You can't just leave us with absolutely nothing. My mother is. Mrs. Howard, I advise you to secure alternative housing within the required $30 day notice period. This is not personal. It is purely a financial reassignment. The call ended abruptly before she could formulate a response. She sat motionless, mouth open, her initial disbelief rapidly transforming into a searing, dark anger. She immediately started texting Paul, her fingers stabbing at the screen. You sick bastard. This is my mother's home. She has nothing to do with this. There was no immediate response. Silence persisted for hours, until dusk painted the walls with melancholy gray-blue shadows, and her reflection in the hallway mirror looked like a woman who hadn't slept in a month. Then, a single notification pinged, a message from Paul. Just one sentence. I gave you the keys. You turned them into weapons. I've only taken them back. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to violently throw the phone against the wall, to storm into whatever corporate office he was hiding in and demand to know how he could be so utterly heartless. She desperately wanted to accuse him of being vengeful, cruel, and punishing her for words she hadn't truly meant. But what accusation could she make that wasn't overwhelmingly hypocritical? She had publicly celebrated the end of their marriage before it was finalized. She had turned their separation into an aggressive public performance. She had transformed him into a joke. The social media landscape was littered with memes, reels, and group chats ridiculing the old guy still stuck in analog. Now, that very old guy had utterly defeated her using the only mechanism that truly endures, legal infrastructure. She had enjoyed a luxurious life built on his quiet efforts. She mistakenly interpreted his silence as weakness. She confused his kindness for blindness. She firmly believed she would be the one walking away with all the baggage and control of the narrative. Now, the only headlines were playing in her own mind. Designer evicted. Divorce queen loses studio, apartment, and control. She stood in her mother's kitchen, where a single light bulb flickered, already signaling its imminent failure. No amount of spa treatments could fix this. There were no clients left to rely on. No platform remained for her to tell her side of the story. She opened the empty refrigerator, then the freezer, It contained only her mother's frozen peas and an old ice tray. She grabbed the bottle of white wine from the counter, which was half empty, warm, and sour, and poured it into a mug. She sat on the floor, pulling the blanket tight around her. In the profound silence, she could hear her own thoughts screaming. She had been the star of the show for so long. Now, she couldn't even guarantee the power stayed on. The bank's enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows cast long, stark shadows across the polished marble floor as Melissa stood at the main counter, utterly disheveled and shaking. Her designer scarf was haphazardly tied around her neck. Mascara trails ran down both cheeks, and the heels she once wore as armor now clicked with patent desperation. This was not a woman entering with confidence. This was someone praying the building wouldn't notice her humiliation. "I need to speak with Paul Howard," she managed, her voice cracking halfway through the request. "Please, I'm here to finalize the settlement." The manager, Charles, emerged from his office once more. He was the same man, but his demeanor was different, less tentative now, almost resigned, as if he had been fully prepared for this exact scenario. "Please have a seat," he suggested gently. "I believe he is en route." She refused to sit, pacing restlessly. Her phone was nearly dead again. She didn't care. Her mother was no longer answering her calls. Her assistant had resigned via a single-line email. Her website was down. The studio's Instagram account had been quietly deactivated, likely by Paul's team following the occupancy revocation. Every digital strand she had woven around her life was now frayed and dissolving. Yet, she still harbored a belief, a faint hope, that if she could just talk to Paul face-to-face, she could somehow undo some of the damage. Maybe cry a little, strike an emotional chord, remind him of their early years, and prove she wasn't the villain she seemed to be. Then the glass doors swung open, and he arrived. Not with a swagger, not with smug arrogance, but in that same tailored suit, with that same composed stride, and that same profound silence that she now, finally, recognized not as a void, but as pure, absolute power. The kind of power that has no need to raise its voice because every necessary detail has already been finalized. Her breath caught. Paul offered a brief nod to Charles, who immediately stepped aside. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Charles inquired, "Sir, are we ready to proceed with the final transfer authorization?" Paul looked at Melissa for the very first time. Not at her, but seemingly right through her. "Not necessary," he said softly. "We already have full control." Melissa's heart plummeted to her stomach. Her lips parted. "What do you mean we?" Before the question could hang unanswered, another figure materialized in the doorway. A woman in a sharply tailored black dress, her hair pulled back tightly, carrying a leather binder. She entered with an air of profound authority, not mere confidence, but command. The kind of presence that signaled she possessed every fact and was not bluffing. She stopped next to Paul, opened her binder, and began to speak. "Mrs. Howard," she stated in a neutral, clinical tone, "as of 9:17 a.m. this morning, pursuant to signed instructions and verified action by the Board of Directors of Rowan Sentinel Holdings, you have been formally and permanently removed from all financial accounts, real estate properties, asset trusts, occupancy licenses, operational business agreements, and affiliated access systems." Melissa felt her knees give way. The woman continued, completely unperturbed. "All passwords, authorizations, powers of attorney, and platform credentials have been permanently revoked. Furthermore, a notice has been issued to your credit partners to suspend any pending transactions tied to former accounts you previously accessed. You are no longer designated as a beneficiary, signatory, or affiliated party to any of Mr. Howard's holdings." The words were precise, clean, and final. Melissa grabbed the marble edge of the counter, the only thing keeping her upright. "You can't do this," she whispered brokenly. "You can't just erase me." Paul offered no response. The lawyer simply closed her binder and offered a polite nod to the manager, then to Paul. That was the final act. Melissa looked at Paul, desperately searching for any trace of emotion in his face. Pity, rage, regret. Nothing. Just the quiet man she had once scorned, underestimated, and mocked over dinner while filming a TikTok about men who confuse money with control. She realized she had fundamentally misunderstood everything. Paul did not confuse money with control. He fully comprehended the concept. And while she had spent months constructing a fleeting narrative of likes, posts, hashtags, and champagne toasts, he had spent years meticulously building an unshakable system, one that patiently waited for her ego to light the match, and then quietly watched as it completely burned down the bridge she assumed was hers. No raised voice, no vengeful speech, just absolute, unyielding procedure. She stood paralyzed in the middle of the bank branch. Customers moved around her, the quiet conversations and the hum of office phones merging into a muffled buzz. Paul turned and walked toward the exit. Melissa took one reflexive step after him, her hand reaching out, not even sure why. He never looked back, not once, and that singular action, more than anything else, confirmed the end. Not just the marriage, or the money, or the life. She was gone, and he had already deleted the backup file.